Hello and welcome to The Brief. I'm Jaffar Hasnain. Protests, riots and violence have gripped the U.S. by its neck. It's been more than 6 days since the brutal killing of George Floyd, and protesters are still out on the streets. Some disturbing scenes have emerged from various cities of the United States. President Donald Trump has hinted towards invoking the Insurrection Act, which will basically allow him to deploy U.S. military within its soil. If he does so, what would be the consequences, and what does the future entail for the United States? And most importantly, what would it take to de-escalate tensions? We will discuss all this and more in this episode of The Brief, but first, in order to set up the discussion for today, let's have a look at this report.
Protests against police brutality are continuing to spread and intensify in the United States as demonstrators demand for justice.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want now?
In Los Angeles, the National Guard was seen patrolling the streets, and scores of demonstrators who stayed out after the city's curfew were arrested. Clashes between protesters and police and looting of some stores in New York City gave way to a relative silence by the night's end. Although rallies on behalf of George Floyd and other victims of police brutality have been largely peaceful during the day, after dark, each night crowds have turned to yachting, vandalism, arson, and looting. Thousands of protesters in Portland, Oregon, and a handful in Los Angeles, California on Tuesday evening laid down on the ground with their hands behind their backs, demanding justice for George Floyd. In Portland, thousands of protesters marched peacefully to the city's Burnside Bridge, where they laid down with their hands behind their backs for 9 minutes, as many repeated the phrase, "I can't breathe," a rallying cry echoing the dying words of George Floyd. Hours after the curfew was imposed on Tuesday night, some protesters continued to march in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and other parts of the New York City. Police made several arrests in Manhattan as they urged people to move on. According to the New York City Police Department, at least 200 protesters were arrested during a protest on Tuesday evening. Members of the New York Police Department engaged in an angry confrontation Tuesday with journalists covering protests across the city.
Okay. Don't be like that. Respect the press.
They grabbed innocent people for no reason and just started cuffing them, pushing them to the ground. This dude he's a journalist and a press. He has a press pass, and they pushed him to the ground.
At a leafy Seattle intersection, protesters crowded together to listen to speeches. Elsewhere in the nation's capital, demonstrations lacked the tensions of previous nights.
There's a lot of racial injustice in our country. It's very ingrained in the roots of our country. The police violence, the street violence against minorities, it's all a result of that.
In the early hours of Wednesday, police shot tear gas at protesters near the White House as demonstrations continued across the country for the 9th consecutive day.
Welcome back. As you saw in the report, that the current situation in the United States is dire. Protests, riots have erupted in many different cities, and the police is struggling to contain them. Let's discuss this further. Joining us now from the U.S. is Mr. Andre Perry. He is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. Thank you very much, Mr. Perry, for joining us today on The Brief. Like I mentioned, the situation is dire. Protests and riots have erupted in many different cities across the United States. So, first and foremost, this is what I would like to ask you. Does the United States have a racial problem?
Yes, it's unfortunate that the killing of George Floyd has sparked awareness around the structural inequalities that are occurring here in the United States. We have a racial problem, no question, and it is manifested in public policy. And so the outcomes, the economic outcomes that we see in Black America, where black households earn significantly less than their white counterparts, are arrested more than our white peers. Home ownership is wanting in the black community. But all of these disparities have roots in structural inequality, meaning that there's policies that favor whiteness in this country. And the killing essentially broke the straw on the camel's back, as we say here in the States. It was the one episode that really people became so frustrated with it, that people started taking their grievances to the street. And so we do have a racial problem. It's not just about bad policing. It's about the overarching structures that govern our lives in the United States all have biases in them that disfavor black folk and favor whiteness.
Okay, Mr. Perry, this is what I wonder now. America is certainly not a stranger to this problem. There have been multiple incidents over the past few years of African Americans being subjected to excessive police force and brutality. So please help us understand, why did the killing of George Floyd become a tipping point for the people of the United States?
Well, I think this particular incident became a tipping point because it was filmed in the midst of another crisis, the COVID pandemic. But there was another few incidents within the last few weeks. Breonna Taylor was killed. You also had another jogger who was killed recently by vigilantes. That this problem came at a time when folks were reeling economically, socially. And so the filming of it and the brutality of it, that you would see a officer kneeling in the back of the neck of a person under their custody for 12 minutes. 2 minutes, the person held their knee on the neck 2 minutes beyond when the Floyd was unconscious. And so it was just a horrific event that essentially that laid sort of the capstone for a series of other events here in the United States. So it was just one of many, and people are just frustrated.
Of course, by a series of other events, you mean riots and protests. Now, Mr. Perry, this is what I wonder. There are people who are protesting lawfully, but some have engaged in violence and riots. I was going through my Twitter feed and I saw many people quoting Martin Luther King, one of his famous quotes that a riot is the voice of the unheard. So please tell me, what is your navigation through this?
Well, it's unclear who's rioting and who's protesting. I mean, most people are protesting in a civil manner and a nonviolent manner. There are some who take advantage of this situation, but even folks who are quote unquote looting places are usually poor folk needing goods, services. But I just want to be clear that the damage done by racism far exceed the damage caused by riots in the street. That many of the buildings will be rebuilt, cars restored, or new cars will be purchased. But you can't do away with the wealth gap that is created by racism in the United States, where blacks earn, or in terms of wealth, have about 1/10 of what white people have. You can't just fix that. And so the focus should be on the structural inequalities that lead to a riot, not necessarily the riot itself. A lot of attention is placed on buildings, not enough placed on policies that facilitate inequality.
I mean, it's just deplorable to say the least. We are in the 21st century, but racists and bigots still live among us. So, Mr. Perry, this is what I would like to ask you now. What would it take to fix this problem?
Well, we focus a lot on the individual racism that occurs, but there's a lot of racism that's simply baked into policy, and we have got to deal with those policies that take sort of individual actions to scale. So I don't necessarily want to control what people think or how they perceive me, but we should not have laws and policies that recreate social inequality in this country. And right now we have lots of housing policy, policing policy, education policy that is built to suppress Black people. And so I'm more worried about changing those policies because to a certain extent, there will be racists in this country. There will be racist presidents in this country. But we should have policy that oversees or supersedes those forms of individual racism.
Now, Dr. Perry, a key question here. What is your navigation through President Donald Trump's way of handling this crisis? Do you think he's exacerbating the situation?
Yes, Donald Trump is doing what many presidents before him has done. When his back is against the wall, he blames Black people, he blames minorities, he blames immigrants for the state of the country. He has absolved himself from being responsible for Black Americans in terms of economic outcomes by blaming us for the state of Black America. His words against his Congress women who telling them to go back where they came from during his term, his comments around immigrants and Mexicans are deplorable. His commentary towards Black cities horrific and violent. He is a racist president, but he's not the first, and he won't be the last. And so we've got to not necessarily worry about the president. We know what he's going to do. We know what he's going to say. We need to have a movement that forces the next president to establish policies and practices that uplift Black Americans. And but Trump is far gone. He is far gone. He will stoke racism and racial division to move his political chances, and we know that, and we're going to have to incorporate that into the political equation in terms of how to defeat this wicked president. But I'm certainly focused on changing policy moving forward, with or without him in the office.
Mr. Perry, now my last question to you. The U.S. presidential elections are just around the corner. How do you think this particular incident is going to impact the outcome of the elections? And how do you think this is going to impact the African American voters?
Yeah, this election is going to be very contentious. Trump has a solid backing of white supporters, and he only needs a few percentages of African Americans to run away with this contest. But he has shown his true colors, so to speak, of not supporting African Americans. We see it in his policy, we see it in his rhetoric. And so I do think that people will be energized for this election, but it's going to be a tough election because he is willing to use voter suppression. He's willing to use nefarious means to get ahead. So it's going to be tough, but folks will be mobilized. People will remember who benefited during COVID, in terms of the CARES relief package, who were the beneficiaries of that, and it wasn't Black people for the most part, in terms of PPP loans and other programs that spending bill offered. And so I do think it's going to impact the election. I do think that fewer people of color are going to vote for President Trump as a result, but I also think that there are some good thinking white people who will look at this president and what he's done over the last 4 years and go, enough is enough. The country is in trouble. It's on the fringe. We need someone to lead us into the future.
All right, Mr. Andre Perry, thank you very much for talking to us on The Brief. We really appreciate your analysis, and please stay safe.
All right, take care.
Now, earlier today, I interviewed one of George Floyd's friend. Let's have a listen. Now, Cory Paul has known George Floyd for 10 years, and he joins us now from the United States. Cory, thank you very much for being with us. I'm really sorry for what you had to go through. Words cannot describe this tragedy. But I do want to start this interview on a positive note. I was just going through my Twitter feed and I saw George Floyd's daughter saying, "Daddy changed the world." And I mean, he did, didn't he? Please tell me, how proud are you of him?
Yeah, so it's not a question. It's not a question at all that she was 100% right. I had the opportunity to first meet George when coming into Third Ward to connect with the community. I'm not from the neighborhood George was from in Houston. In Houston, George is from a neighborhood called Third Ward. I'm not from there. I'm from another neighborhood called South Park. So I was coming in along with my church to connect with the community, build with the community. You know, our church was right there. So we wanted to be a part of everything that was going on. And so George was already talking about him changing the world. He had already, now the world knows about it, but he was already preaching about love and believing in God and advocating against gun violence. He was already doing those things. And it's people that know George even better than I do that he helped raise from kids up who would tell you that's exactly what he represented. So I got a chance to meet George through doing ministry work, doing mission work. George was helping us. He helped us come into the community and be accepted. We couldn't have did that without George because he was so loved and respected that he basically, as my friend says, gave us an endorsement deal to be able to do the work.
Now, Cory, you already described how George was like a person, but please shed some more light on how you felt when you first met him.
Yeah, so when I first met George, we were in Third Ward, and myself and a friend of mine, we both are music artists. And so we wanted to shoot visuals and capture the neighborhood and collab with, people in the neighborhood and all of this. And we met Floyd, and Floyd was our, person of peace. He allowed us to come in. And so he was telling us, man, I love what you're doing. I love what y'all doing. I love what you represent. He say, yeah, if it's about God business, then it's my business. And so he was just letting us know, man, whatever y'all need, if y'all going somewhere, y'all tell them Big Floyd said y'all good. This is what we need out here. This is what I'm about. And so knowing that being from the neighborhoods that we're from, getting that type of approval is not something to just be taken lightly, because we were visitors into his home. And so he put his name, his reputation, he put all that, on us, because he was a partner in what we were doing, and so that was my first time being able to meet George. And then from there, our interactions were when he would come to help us set up for church, help us drag out chairs, bring out baptism pools, help us with the breaking stuff down and putting it back up, all of that aspect of like literally serving, the community.
Okay, now, Cory, George is certainly not the first black American who was subjected to police brutality and violence in the United States. There have been multiple cases in the past. I'm sure you and George must have had a conversation about this. Can you please tell us what were George's thoughts about this?
So I can't speak to George direct thoughts about that question. Like I don't have a quote or anything like that from him. But what I can say is, as a black man in America from the neighborhoods we're from, the conversation about the violence or brutality by some police officers against people of color, that's something you start talking about that when you're like 9-10 years old. You know, like you have to be made aware of it very early. So we grow up with that as an understanding that that's how things have gone, you know. And so understanding that not every police officer is bad, just like every black person isn't this or every white person isn't that. But you have to know there are groups of them all around the world that do judge you and do dehumanize us being from where we're from. And so I can't speak on directly quoting George, but I can say, coming from where we're from, it's not anything new, unfortunately.
Okay, now, Cory, I have a tough question for you here. I'm not sure if you're ready to answer this. There are allegations against George Floyd that he was using counterfeit money to buy cigarettes. I'm not sure, again, if you're able to answer this question, but is there anything you would like to say on George Floyd's behalf?
So I can't speak on George's behalf. I can't speak on his behalf or anything like that. But I can speak to that. And it's irrelevant. Whether the money was counterfeit or not, it's irrelevant. Because it's an accusation. Even if it was, right? It's an accusation. And in America, you are innocent until proven guilty. So before George is treated as a guilty man or treated as anything than a citizen that police officers work for and supposed to serve, until he's convicted of something, right? Then it's just speculation. They are not trained in counterfeit, if money is counterfeit or not, I'm sure of it, right? So they have to go through the proper channels of whatever that is before he's anything other than a civilian at the store. So whether it was or wasn't is irrelevant. And even if it was, what they did was still unjustified. It should change nothing. If it came out and it was counterfeit, right, it should change absolutely nothing. Right. But I'll also add, you have several people that have came out, and I said myself as well, I wouldn't know what a counterfeit bill looked like. Right. I could have a counterfeit bill on me right now and I don't pay attention. You know, I get money. I get out the ATM or whatever and I go and pay, you know. And so I think that's completely irrelevant. It has nothing to do with anything else that's going on. And then from the aspect of knowing that here's one for you. George went to Minnesota through a Christian program for job training and placement. So he went to Minnesota, and it's even pictures online of him pursuing getting his CDL so he can drive 18-wheelers. So we're not talking about some guy that's lazy or nothing like that. This is a man who's working and prospering and growing. You know what I'm saying? So just that whole narrative, they tried to have it as a distraction, but it's trash, and it holds no weight to the life that was taken and the inhumane way it was taken.
Cory, I'm sure you are using the word inhumane for the lack of a better word. His murder cannot be described in words. I can tell you, sitting here in Turkey, most of the Turks share your grief and sorrow. In fact, the killing of George Floyd has shocked much of the world. Now, in the aftermath of his killing, protests and riots erupted across the United States, and some people have been reported to use violence. I would like to know, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like you have to separate the different protests and riots and going on. I know you're speaking to the riots, and so Martin Luther King said that riots are oftentimes the voice of the unheard, right? And so you have different subsets of people. Now, to the people who are genuinely passionate and are trying to the best of their ability to communicate and organize and protest, but are being met with further suppression and tear gassing and the as our president says, the dominance trying to dominate them. And I understand. The first thing is I get it. I understand how sometimes you can feel like enough is enough, right? To the people that are being pushed to this level and it may spill over, I get it. But if we're speaking about with George, what we know to be true with George, George was unity, George was love, George was progression, right? And so while it's understood, I think the bigger thing to look at is not the effect, but look at what's causing it. What's pushing these people to this? What is making them feel like they haven't been heard and they have to speak out in extreme ways, right? But I think there's another large subset that has nothing to do with George or injustice. I think you have a lot of people with ulterior motives. A lot of the looting and some of the stuff that you see, a lot of that stuff don't have anything to do with George. That's just opportunists or people that are plants or that has nothing to do with them. So I feel like that's something different. But to the people where they're trying desperately and still just not being met with anything, and you see that overflow, I think first we have to seek to understand before being understood as a nation, that is judging them. But here in Houston yesterday, we did a march to City Hall that was 60,000 plus, and it was done in peace and in unity and with the mayor of our city as well as members of George family.
Well said, Cory. Now, one of my last questions to you. I'm sure you're aware of the fact that the killing of George Floyd has shocked the world. In fact, it sent shockwaves across the globe. The problem is not just limited to the United States. Racial discrimination takes place across the world. So, as one of the closest friends of George Floyd, what is your message to the world?
I would say this. So, in neighborhoods across the world, I'm going to speak from the perspective of neighborhoods that are disenfranchised, marginalized, low income, impoverished. You have so many of these neighborhoods or groups of people who feel like they've been forgotten, and it's painful and it hurts and it's been happening for a long time. And whether it be politicians or people in power or whoever, they talk about change or they talk about the need for improvement. But what they don't understand is that oftentimes that is already occurring from a cultural level. So the change that they think needs to happen, the progression they think needs to happen, George Floyd was a change maker. He was a thought leader. He was progressively unifying his community and advocating against gun violence. He was already doing all of these things. And so because in America and across the world, a person of color can often be dehumanized or seen as less than and has no true value in the eyes of several people, that powerful work that's often being done in these communities and it's being done right now goes unheard, it's suppressed, or it's ignored. And so I would hope that this the murder of George would really draw attention to decision makers and to people of power, and also to us on the ground. It would draw our attention to each other to realize that the united we stand thing is actually true if we believed in it. And so when you think about justice and you think about people coming together for change, they were able to murder a person who was actively doing that. And we're having a fight for this justice because there's still a gap in seeing the human value of that person, right? So I really would hope this causes everybody to get closer to the ground and truly understand what's going on, and from understanding that, connect with local organizations to change policy, to change legislation, to get the right people on the ballot to vote. Just wherever you at, just Google, social justice organizations wherever you are, put in your city or your state or whatever, and whether you live in an hour or a day or whatever, just let this be the first step.
Absolutely. Cory Paul, thank you very much for doing this. I cannot thank you enough for participating in this special program. I'm really sorry once again for what you had to go through, but I can tell you one thing with certainty. The whole world stands with George Floyd. And what happened to him cannot be described in words. It is tragic, to say the least. I'm hopeful that one day we will see a world which will be free of racial injustice and racial discrimination. And yes, it is true that George Floyd has indeed changed the world. His legacy is going to live for generations after us. On that note, thank you very much once again, and please stay safe. Welcome back, and this brings us to the end of another episode of The Brief. Racism in any shape or form cannot be tolerated. It is more than unfortunate that even in the 21st century, racists and bigots still live among us. What would it take to end this seemingly never-ending problem? Well, this is a question which is on everyone's mind at the moment. The answer lies in standing up as one force against bigotry and racism, and protesting peacefully. Violence is not the way forward, and those who are engaging in violence at this point are doing a great disservice to the legacy of George Floyd. On that note, I'm Jaffar Hasnain. I'll see you with another episode of The Brief very soon.